recall when you were here a couple of years ago, you were talking about the role of Russia as a protector of Syria and Syrian interests. And what's changed in the last couple of years? Do you still think they have an important role to play, and they dictating terms in terms of geopolitics of what's going on?
Yeah, that's working now? Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, Russia is undoubtedly continuing to play a very important role, specifically in Syria and with regard to the Iranians. It would not be exaggerating the matter to say that the Assad regime could not possibly have survived in Syria were it not for the assistance afforded it by the Russians, and most specifically in terms of the provision, well, in two ways. First of all, in terms of the determined provision of weaponry, which has continued from day one and continues to this day. The arms ships heading all the way from Ukraine, all the way up through the Straits, and then up past Cyprus and up to Tartus, to the port of Tartus, still held by the Assad regime, bringing with them that lifeblood for the regime of weapons and ammunition. The Russians, by the way, don't give this stuff away for free. And what happens is that the Iranians provide the cash to Bashar, and he then buys the weaponry from the Russians. But the Russians are willing to sell. And this has been absolutely crucial for Bashar al-Assad, firstly. The other way in which Russia has been vital for the survival and well-being of Bashar al-Assad is that the Russians, of course, are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which has meant that any possibility of effective action against the regime via the UNSC has been rendered impossible because of the presence of a Russian veto. So in those two ways, they've been absolutely vital for the survival of the Assad regime. The Russians are also the providers of weaponry via the Syrians or via the Iranians to Hezbollah. That's mainly Russian weapons types that Hezbollah is using. And of course, the Russian relationship with Iran also is of importance, if ambiguous. The Russians are the armourers also of the Iranians. And yet at the same time, the Russians don't really want the Iranians to go nuclear. They want to make some money selling them some material to the Bushehr reactor, but they don't want to let it go beyond a certain level. Now this brings me to the main point I want to make about the Russian stance in the region, which is that ultimately this is all lots of noise and it matters on a certain level, but it's not serious on the most serious level. Russia is a country which currently is punching vastly above its weight on the international stage. What I mean by that is that the strength, such as it is of the Russian economy and of the Russian society, do not in fact support and sustain the kind of adventures the Russians are going in for. You know, the Russian economy is excessively dependent on gas. And once gas prices fall, no more Putin return to be a superpower. It's as simple as that. So unlike in the case of the Chinese, or indeed in the case of the United States, you know, there is not a strong economic and social base underlying the Russian diplomatic and military adventures which we're currently witnessing, which means, to conclude my response on this, that we certainly need to take the Russians into account, but it's not going to be the Russians who end up forming around themselves a new alliance in the Middle East which will take on the Americans or take on anybody else. The Russian role in the Middle East ultimately is that of a spoiler. The Russians regard the Middle East as the backyard of the West. They think the West are interfering in their backyard, in the Baltic and in Ukraine, so they want to try to interfere to return the compliment by making trouble here and there in the Middle East. Ultimately it comes down to that and not a great deal more. So we should be concerned about it, but we shouldn't be imagining, that, in my estimation at least, that we're about to be seeing this sort of enormous historic return of Russia to the region in the way that it was in the 1960s, for example. That's not, I think, going to happen.